1900, Setenter, Columbia Records Studio A, New York City. Miles Davis was in the middle of one of the most creative periods of his life. He'd just released Bitches Brew, the album that would change jazz forever, selling more copies than any jazz album in a decade. Columbia Records was happy. Finally, after 15 years of Miles pushing boundaries and making music that was difficult to market, he'd made something that sold. But Miles wasn't interested in repeating his success. He was already moving forward. The sessions he was recording in 1970 made Bitches Brew sound conventional. Electric pianos layered over African polyrhythms, synthesizers creating sounds nobody had heard before, no chord changes, no standard jazz structure, nothing that radio could play, nothing that fit into any category. Miles called it the next thing. Columbia would call it something else. Unsellable. When the sessions were finished, Miles had what he considered some of the most innovative music he'd ever created. He was excited. This was jazz moving into the future. This was what he'd been working toward for 20 years. He delivered the tapes to Columbia Records and waited for them to schedule the release. The call came a week later. "Miles, we need to talk about the new recordings." Miles knew from the tone that this wasn't going to be good news. He went to Columbia's offices, sat down with the AAN director, the head of jazz, and a few executives he'd never met before. They played the tapes back for him, as if he hadn't been there when they were recorded. When the music ended, there was silence. "Well," Miles said. The AAN director cleared his throat. "Miles, it's very experimental." "That's the point. But how do we market it? There's no single we can pull. No radio station will play this. It doesn't fit into any format." Miles looked at them. "It's not supposed to fit into a format. It's supposed to be new." "That's the problem," one of the executives said. "It's too new." Miles felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What are you saying?" "We're saying we can't release this. Not now. Maybe in a few years when the market catches up." "The market doesn't catch up," Miles said. "The music leads. The market follows. That's how this works." The AAN director shook his head. "Miles, we love your music. You know we do, but Bitches Brew was a risk that paid off. This is too far, even for you." "Too far for me?" Miles stood up. "There is no too far for me. I make the music. You sell it. That's the deal. We can't sell what we can't explain." Miles looked at each of them, executives in suits, who'd made millions off his creativity, who'd told him Kind of Blue was too subtle, then watched it become the best-selling jazz album in history, who'd said Bitches Brew was too weird, then celebrated when it went gold. "You said the same thing about every album I've made for the last 15 years, Miles said. "And you've been wrong every time. This is different. It's only different because you're scared of it." They went back and forth for over an hour, Miles arguing that this was the natural evolution of what he'd been doing, the executives arguing that there was evolution, and then there was commercial suicide. Finally, the head of jazz said the words that would haunt Miles for the rest of his life. "We're putting this in the vault until the market is ready for it." Miles stared at him. "The vault? We'll hold on to the tapes, revisit them in a few years, maybe 5 years from now. After you've put out a few more commercial albums, we can position this as..." "No, you don't get to lock up my music and decide when the world is ready for it. This is my work. Miles, according to your contract, we have final say on what gets released and when." That was the moment Miles realized he'd made a mistake. All those years of negotiating for creative control in the studio, and he'd never thought to negotiate for release control. Columbia could record whatever he wanted, but they could also shelf it forever. "This is my best work," Miles said quietly. "This is what I've been building toward for 20 years. Then we'll make sure it gets released properly, when the time is right." Miles walked out of that meeting, knowing the time would never be right. Not according to Columbia, not according to executives who saw music as a product and innovation as risk. Over the next few years, Miles asked about the shelved album regularly. "When are you releasing the 1970 sessions? We're still evaluating market conditions." The market doesn't matter. The music matters. The market is how we sell music, Miles. He tried different approaches, arguing that his newer work built on those sessions, that fans needed to hear the progression, arguing that bootlegs were starting to circulate, that they should release an official version, arguing that he was Miles Davis and he'd earned the right to have his music heard. Nothing worked. The album stayed in the vault. By the mid-1970s, Miles had mostly stopped asking. He knew the answer. He focused on making new music, on pushing forward, on not looking back at what might have been. But it ate at him. He'd tell musicians he worked with about the shelved album. "I made something in 1970 that nobody's heard, something that would change how people think about music, and it's sitting in a vault because some executives are too scared to let people hear it." His friends would ask, "Why don't you re-record it?" Miles would shake his head. "You can't recapture a moment. That music came from where I was in 1970. I'm not there anymore. That album is what it is. Perfect, the way we recorded it. And nobody will ever hear it." The frustration bled into his relationship with Columbia. Every contract negotiation became tense. Every album release became a battle. Miles trying to push boundaries, Columbia trying to make him more commercial. In 1975, Miles took a 5-year break from recording, retired, stopped performing. The official reason was his health, but people close to him knew part of it was exhaustion from fighting with Columbia. Tired of making music only to have executives tell him it was too advanced, too weird, too difficult to market. When he came back in 1980, he eventually left Columbia entirely, 30 years with the label, and he walked away, signed with Warner Brothers. They gave him creative control. They released what he recorded, but even at Warner, Miles would think about those 1970 sessions, the album that nobody had heard, his best work, locked away. In interviews in the 1980s, when asked about unreleased material, Miles would sometimes mention it. "You have unreleased albums? Columbia has an album I recorded in 1970, been locked in their vault for 15 years. Will they ever release it?" Miles would shrug. "Maybe when I'm dead. That's when they make money off artists. When we can't argue anymore." It was said, bitterly, but it turned out to be prophetic. September 28, 1991. Within months, Columbia started going through the vaults, looking for unreleased Miles Davis material. The artist who'd been too difficult when he was alive suddenly became very valuable in death. They found the 1970 sessions, 21 years old, untouched since Miles delivered them. The executives who'd shelved the album were long gone, retired, moved on to other companies. A new generation of Columbia employees listened to the tapes. "This is incredible," someone said. "Why wasn't this released?" An older executive who'd been there in the 70s explained, "The label thought it was too experimental, too weird, couldn't figure out how to market it." Market it? It's Miles Davis. You put his name on it, and people buy it. That's not how they thought back then. They kept listening, track after track of music that was indeed experimental, indeed strange, indeed unlike anything else, but also brilliant. visionary, exactly what Miles had said. It was, we should release this. When Miles was alive, he asked about this album for years. We kept saying we'd release it, eventually. Then, let's release it now. Better late than never. Miles died, waiting to hear this released. I'm not sure better late than never applies. But Columbia had a business to run, and Miles Davis' posthumous releases sold, so they prepared the album for release. 1996. 26 years after it was recorded, 5 years after Miles died, Columbia released the shelved sessions, remastered, repackaged, with liner notes explaining that this was long lost Miles Davis music from his experimental period. The critical response was immediate and unanimous. A masterpiece. Visionary work that was decades ahead of its time. This album would have changed jazz in 1970. Released now, it still sounds futuristic. Miles Davis was right. Columbia was wrong. Young musicians discovered it, heard sounds that influenced hip-hop, electronic music, experimental rock, realized that Miles had been there first, in 1970, and nobody had been allowed to hear it. The album sold well, better than Columbia had feared in 1970. Miles had been right about that too, but Miles wasn't there to see it. He died not knowing if anyone would ever hear the music he'd considered his best work. He'd spent 21 years asking about it. 21 years being told maybe someday. 21 years knowing that his innovation was locked away because executives were afraid. And he died 5 years before they finally admitted he'd been right all along. Herbie Hancock, when asked about the posthumous release, said Miles tried to tell them for years that this music mattered, that people would understand it. They didn't listen, and now Miles isn't here to say, "I told you so," which is the real tragedy. The success of the shelved album opened floodgates. Columbia went back through the vaults, found more unreleased Miles material, put out box sets, special editions, collections of outtakes. All of it sold. All of it received critical acclaim. All of it proved that Miles had known better than the executives what was good and what would last. But every release was bittersweet, because Miles should have been there, should have been able to hear people finally understand what he'd been trying to do. The story of the shelved album became a cautionary tale in the music industry, about what happens when business people override artists, about the cost of playing it safe, about how fear of innovation means missing innovation entirely. Music schools teach it now. The Miles Davis Columbia Vault, as an example of how labels can be their own worst enemies, how the safe choice is often the wrong choice. But what they don't teach, what can't be taught, is what it felt like for Miles. To create something you know is brilliant. To have executives tell you it's too weird. To spend 2 decades asking about it. To die not knowing if anyone would ever hear it. That's not a business lesson. That's a tragedy. The album is available now. You can stream it, buy it, study it. Hear what Miles heard in 1970. And when you listen, remember Miles fought for 21 years to let you hear this. Columbia fought for 21 years to keep you from hearing it. Miles was right. Columbia was wrong. But Miles didn't get to see it. Subscribe for more stories about artists whose best work was hidden, about innovation being shelved because it scared the gatekeepers, and about the music we almost lost because someone decided the world wasn't ready for it. Because the saddest question isn't what if this had been released in 1970. The saddest question is, how many other artists have their best work locked in vaults right now?